31 years. That's how long I kept the secret. 31 years of being called a gold digger, a liar, a woman who walked away from her family with nothing but her pride and a suitcase she'd packed in the dark. The reading was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October, at a law office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Houston. I'd been to that building once before, nearly 3 decades ago, under very different circumstances. Back then, I was the one signing documents. Back then, I was the one giving things away. I arrived early. I always arrive early, a habit left over from 30 years of nursing, where being late meant someone didn't get their medication, someone's chart went unread, someone's pain went unmanaged for another hour. Old habits don't leave you, they just change shape. The receptionist, a young woman with a sleek bun and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, offered me coffee. I accepted, though I knew I wouldn't drink it. My stomach had been wrong since I woke up at 4 in the morning and watched the ceiling until the sky outside turned gray. My son arrived at 9:47, 13 minutes before the appointed time, with his wife on his arm in a posture I recognized, the posture of a man who had already decided how the morning would end. My son, Daniel, was 53 years old. He wore a dark suit that probably cost more than my first car. He did not look at me when he walked in. His wife, Renee, looked at me. She gave me a smile that lasted exactly long enough to be considered polite, and then turned away. I had chosen a seat near the window, separate from the long conference table where the attorney's assistant had already arranged folders and water glasses in careful rows. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, and my coffee cup on the small table beside me, untouched, growing cold. Daniel took a seat at the far end of the table. He opened his phone and began reading something, or pretending to. Renee leaned close and said something quietly near his ear. He nodded without looking up. I watched my son the way you watch weather coming in from the Gulf, with the particular dread of someone who has learned not to be surprised by the damage a storm can do. The attorney's name was Mr. Calloway. He was a compact man in his late 60s with silver hair and the careful, neutral expression of someone who had spent 40 years in a room exactly like this one, delivering news that changed people's lives, and had learned to let the documents do the talking. He came in at exactly 10 o'clock, set his briefcase on the table, and looked at both of us in turn. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, nodding at me first. "It's Patricia," I said. "Please." He nodded. "Patricia." Then he looked toward the other end of the table. "Mr. Holloway." Daniel put his phone face down on the table. "Let's get this done," he said. Mr. Calloway sat down. His assistant placed a sealed envelope in front of him, cream-colored, thick, with my late ex-husband's name embossed in the upper left corner, Robert Holloway. The name still did something strange to my chest after all these years. Not grief, exactly. Something older than grief. Something that had been living in me so long it had stopped having a name. "Before I open this," Mr. Calloway said, "I want to note for the record that both named parties are present. This is the last will and testament of Robert James Holloway, executed March 14, 2021, and updated with a codicil on September 3, 2023, approximately 14 months before his death." He paused. "Are there any questions before I proceed?" "No," Daniel said. I shook my head. Mr. Calloway broke the seal. I heard my son exhale slowly, settling in, confident. And why wouldn't he be? His father had been a wealthy man, the kind of wealth that Houston's oil and real estate corridors produce quietly, without ceremony, and then leave behind like sediment. Robert had built his company from a 2-man operation in a Pearland strip mall into a regional construction and land development firm worth, by the last estimate I'd seen in a business filing, somewhere north of $160 million. Daniel had worked for that company for 20 years. He'd considered himself, for the last several of those years, essentially its heir apparent. He had never considered me a factor in any of it. He had, in fact, said as much to me 6 weeks earlier at his father's funeral in the parking lot of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church on River Oaks Boulevard, while the other mourners were still inside talking in low voices and eating small sandwiches. "You should know," he said to me, not unkindly but not gently either, that Dad made very clear what he wanted. "You've been divorced for 28 years, Mom. Whatever you think you're owed, just prepare yourself." I had looked at my son, this man I had raised, this person whose fevers I had sat up through, whose college applications I had helped edit at the kitchen table at midnight, and I had said nothing. He took my silence for agreement. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about a great many things. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning is the only way any of this makes sense. Robert and I married in 1983. I was 26. He was 31. He was charming in the way that certain ambitious men are charming, all forward momentum, all certainty, always the most energized person in any room he walked into. I was a registered nurse at Houston Methodist. I was practical, organized, good under pressure. We were, for a while, genuinely happy. Daniel was born in 1971 from Robert's first brief marriage that ended before I came into the picture. Robert had full custody. I became, in every meaningful way, Daniel's mother. I drove him to school, attended his games, held him when he was sick, fought with him when he was a teenager, loved him with a completeness I had not known was possible before he existed in my life. We had our own children too, a daughter, Claire, born in 1985. But Claire lives in Portland now with her family, and she is not part of this story in the way that Daniel is. Claire never needed a villain. Robert's business began struggling in the early 1990s. A series of bad contracts, a partner who turned out to be quietly embezzling, a regional recession that hit construction hard. By 1993, the company was carrying debt that threatened to consume everything we had built together, and there was a lawsuit from a former subcontractor that, if it went badly, could have resulted in personal liability judgments against Robert that would have taken the house, the accounts, and his ability to operate it all. I was working as a charge nurse in the ICU by then. I understood systems. I understood how things failed and how to prevent that failure if you acted before the crisis rather than during it. A family attorney we trusted, a woman named Gloria Hayes, who has since retired to Scottsdale, suggested a legal restructuring. The house, the remaining investment accounts, 3 undeveloped parcels of land Robert had bought in Katy, when land there was still cheap, all of it could be transferred into my name alone. The transfers would be legitimate, properly recorded, executed at fair market value, with nominal consideration of $1 per transaction. A legal standard, a formality, not a statement about worth. The point was protection. If the lawsuit proceeded and judgments were entered against Robert personally, my assets could not be touched. The point was also risk. If Robert and I divorced, those assets were mine. If I died before him, they would pass according to my will, not his. "Do you trust him?" Gloria asked me. "I trust him," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. The way people who have seen marriages end in their offices tend to look at people who say that, "Then sign," she said. I signed. The lawsuit settled 2 years later for a fraction of what had been feared. Robert's business recovered. The restructuring was reversed partially. Some of the accounts went back, but the Katy parcels stayed in my name. We never got around to reversing them. And then life moved on, and we stopped talking about it. What we did not stop doing, it turned out, was growing apart. By 1996, Robert and I were living as polite strangers under the same roof. He had a life I was mostly not part of. I had come to understand, slowly and then all at once, that the man I had married was someone who was capable of loving people the way he loved, good investment opportunities with intensity and strategy, and a horizon in mind that was always somewhere further than where he currently stood. We divorced in the spring of 1997. It was civil. There were no dramatic scenes. We sat across a table from our respective attorneys and divided what remained to divide, and I walked out of that building on a Thursday afternoon in April and drove to Memorial Park and sat by the water for 2 hours without moving. Daniel was 26 by then, old enough to form his own opinion of what had happened. And his opinion, shaped in part by a father who was never entirely honest with him about the finances or the history, was that I had manipulated the situation. That I had used the restructuring to secure assets that should have stayed with the family, that I had taken advantage of a period of vulnerability to position myself. He never said this directly to my face, not for many years. But I felt it the way you feel a shift in pressure before a storm, in the way his calls became less frequent. In the way he stopped bringing his children to visit me without a specific reason. In the way he looked at me at family events with a carefulness that had nothing to do with affection. The Katie parcels. He had found out about them, eventually. Robert must have told him, or he found records, or he simply added up numbers that didn't square. By the time the land had appreciated into something significant, and by 2010, developed, Katie was very significant. Daniel had constructed a complete narrative in his mind about what kind of woman his stepmother was. What he didn't know, because Robert never told him, and I never told him, and Gloria Hayes had retired and moved to Arizona, was that those parcels had been transferred at Robert's explicit request. That the $1 consideration on each deed was not a trick, it was the standard legal mechanism, the same mechanism used in hundreds of thousands of legitimate asset protection transactions every year. What he also didn't know was what I had done with those parcels. Robert remarried in 2002. A woman named Sylvia, who was kind and uncomplicated and gave him the quieter partnership he'd apparently needed. They were happy together, I think. Genuinely. She died of cancer in 2018, and Robert was diminished by the loss in a way that I recognized from the outside as a man who had finally found his right place and then had it taken from him. In the years after Sylvia's death, Robert and I began speaking again. Not romantically, that was finished, and neither of us had any desire to revisit it, but in the way that two people who shared decades and a son and a whole architecture of a life sometimes can. When enough time has passed, and the injuries have healed into scar tissue that no longer pulls. He called me on a Tuesday evening in the spring of 2019. I was sitting in my kitchen in the house I had bought myself in the Heights neighborhood after my retirement, grating nothing, just sitting with a cup of tea, watching the light change in the backyard. "Patricia," he said. "Robert." A pause. "I need to tell you something I should have told Daniel a long time ago, and I need to ask you something." I listened. He told me he'd been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. He told me he had been thinking, in the way that diagnosis makes a person think, about the things left undone and the truths left unspoken. He told me he wanted to correct the record with Daniel, with the history of what had happened between us, with the financial arrangements he had let become distorted in the retelling over 30 years. "I want to establish a trust," he said. "I want to do it right, and I want you to be part of it. Because you were part of what made any of it possible, and I have not been honest about that, and I am sorry." I was quiet for a moment. "What are you asking me, Robert?" "I'm asking if you'll let me fix it." I thought about my son, who had looked at me at every Christmas for 20 years with eyes that believed I was someone I was not. I thought about the $1 on those deed transfers, a dollar that had somehow become, in Daniel's retelling of events, evidence of something corrupt. "Fix it honestly," I said. "Don't clean it up. Tell the truth." "Yes," he said. "That's what I mean." We met 3 times over the following months with Mr. Calloway, who had been Robert's estate attorney since the late 90s. Robert had the will restructured. He had his Parkinson's progression documented. He was careful and thorough in the way that someone is careful and thorough when they know the document they are creating may be the last honest account they ever give. He died in July of last year. The Parkinson's had progressed faster than anyone expected. And then there had been a fall. And then pneumonia. And then it was over. I sat in St. Andrew's Church at his funeral and looked at the wood of the pew in front of me and thought about 31 years and the $1 and what a long distance a person can travel from a signature on a deed to a morning like this one. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat and began to read. I did not look at my son. I looked at my hands, folded in my lap, the knuckles a little thicker than they used to be, the skin looser, the rings I wore on my right hand a modest pearl cluster that had belonged to my mother. To my son, Daniel Robert Holloway, Mr. Calloway read, "I leave the sum of $1. The room went very still. I heard Daniel's chair shift. I heard Renee make a small, involuntary sound. $1, Mr. Calloway continued, as nominal consideration, the same nominal consideration used in the 1994 and 1,995 deed transfers that Daniel has, for 30 years, misunderstood to be evidence of manipulation by his stepmother, Patricia Ann Holloway. I use this amount deliberately, so that my son will finally understand what $1 means in a legal context, not a judgment of worth, but a formality, a mechanism, a truth I should have explained to him decades ago and failed to. I heard Daniel say, very quietly, "What?" Mr. Calloway continued. "The remainder of my estate, including all accounts, holdings, the Holloway Construction and Land Development Company shares, and all associated real property, I leave in equal trust to my daughter Claire Marie Holloway Park and my daughter-in-law Patricia Ann Holloway. In recognition of a debt, I can only partially repay the debt of truth." He set the paper down and picked up a second document. "There is a codicil, executed 14 months ago. Mr. Holloway asked that I read this section in full, in his words." He adjusted his glasses. "Patricia, you asked me to tell the truth. This is me telling it. In 1994 and 1995, I asked you to take the Katie parcels into your name to protect us both from a judgment that could have ended everything I was trying to build. You did it because I asked you, and because you trusted me, and because that is the kind of woman you have always been, someone who acts for the good of the whole even when it costs her individually. When we divorced, you did not use those parcels against me. You returned the liquid assets voluntarily and retained only what we had agreed, years before, you would retain. Daniel does not know this. He was not in the room. I let him build a story that was not true, and I let it stand because correcting it would have required me to admit my own failures, and I was not brave enough to do that for too long a time." Mr. Calloway's voice stayed steady and professional. I had the impression he had read things like this before. "The $1 I leave Daniel is not a punishment. It is an explanation. I hope he is finally old enough to understand what it means." Silence. Then Daniel said my name. I looked up for the first time since Mr. Calloway had begun reading. My son's face was, I want to describe it accurately, not angry. Not yet. It was the face of someone whose story has just had its foundation pulled, who is standing in the wreckage of a narrative they have organized 30 years of feeling around, and who does not yet know what to do with the open space where that narrative used to be. "Is this true?" he asked. I looked at him for a long moment. This man, this person I had sat up with through ear infections and college rejections and a divorce of his own and the loss of his father. "Yes," I said. "You could have told me. Your father asked me not to." And then, after a while, I think I stopped believing it would change anything. I paused. I was wrong about that. Renee had her hand on Daniel's arm. He wasn't shaking, he was very still, actually, in the way that someone is still when they are reorganizing something very large. "The Katie land," he said. "Sold in 2011. I put the proceeds into a trust for your children's education. Claire's children, too." I looked at him steadily. "I've been funding those accounts for 14 years, Daniel. Your kids are going to college. That's already done." He stared at me. He stopped, started again. "You used the money for your children. My grandchildren." I kept my voice even, because that's what you do with money that was meant to protect a family. You protect the family. Renee made a sound then that was not quite crying, something more pressurized than that, something trying not to break open all at once. Daniel looked down at the table. He looked at the single sheet of paper in front of him, the portion of the will Mr. Calloway had passed to him, the section that contained the word $1 and a long explanation from a man who was not here anymore to answer for taking 30 years to say what needed to be said. I did not go to him. I let him sit with it. You cannot rush someone through the demolition of a belief they have lived inside for decades. You can only stay in the room. After a long time, long enough that Mr. Calloway's assistant had quietly refreshed the water glasses and left again, Daniel looked up. "I've been wrong," he said. Not a question. "Yes. For a long time, yes." He pressed his lips together. "I don't know how to." He stopped. He was not a man who did this easily, who stopped in the middle of sentences because he didn't know how to finish them. That alone told me something. "You don't have to know how right now," I said. "There's time." "I said things to you, Mom." There it was. Mom. He had not called me that in years. He had called me Patricia when he needed to create distance, and he had called me nothing at all when distance wasn't enough. "I know," I said. "I said things at the funeral. In the parking lot. I know that too." He looked at me with something open in his face that I had not seen there since he was very young, since the age before he learned to replace openness with certainty. "I'm sorry," he said. The words landed quietly. Not dramatically, not with any of the ceremony that 31 years of waiting for them might have suggested they deserved. Just 2 words, said plainly, by a man who meant them. I felt something in my chest release, not all at once, but the way a knotted muscle releases when it finally decides the emergency is over, slow and aching and deeply, completely necessary. I know, I said again. Mr. Calloway wrapped up the administrative portion with professional efficiency, offered his condolences again as he gathered his papers, and left us alone in the conference room with the October light coming through the windows and a silence that was no longer hostile. We sat there for a while, the 3 of us, Daniel, Renee, and me, in the wreckage and the beginning of something else. Renee asked me how long I had known about the trust Robert was creating. I told her. She asked me why I hadn't said anything sooner, pushed back, corrected the record on my own terms. I thought about how to answer that honestly. Because it wasn't my truth to tell, I said finally. It was your father-in-law's. He needed to be the one to tell it. I just needed to wait long enough for him to get there. Daniel shook his head slowly. 31 years. He got there, I said. That's what matters. It isn't the inheritance. I want to be clear about that. The money, the shares, the estate, those things exist and they are real, and I will not pretend they don't matter, because pretending they don't matter would be its own kind of dishonesty, and I have had enough of dishonesty to last several lifetimes. But the money is not the thing I walked out of that building carrying. What I carried out was simpler and older, and had been waiting 31 years for someone to finally hand it over. My son called me Mom. The October air outside was bright and cool, the kind of day Houston occasionally produces in the fall like an apology for August. I stood on the sidewalk outside the building, my coat over my arm, and I tilted my face up toward the sky and let the sun be warm on my skin for a moment before I moved toward the parking garage. I had a flight to Portland on Thursday. Claire didn't know what had happened yet. I would tell her in person, in her kitchen, probably over wine. She would cry. She cries easily, my daughter, and has never been ashamed of it. I have always admired that about her. I had grandchildren who didn't know their college accounts were already full. I had a son who had spent 30 years building a wall out of a misunderstanding, and who was, right now, in a conference room on the 14th floor, sitting with what it meant to have been wrong, not about something small, not about a detail, but about a person he had known his entire life. There are things in a life that you carry alone for so long that you begin to mistake the weight for your own body. You forget what you were like before the thing was there. You adjust your posture, change your gait, learn to move around the heaviness so efficiently that you convince yourself it has always been part of you, that there was no version of you that existed without it. And then one morning in October, in a lawyer's office, someone reads from a document that a man wrote because he finally found the courage that had taken him 30 years to locate, and the weight is just gone. I stood there on the sidewalk in the October sun for another minute. I was 63 years old. I was retired. I had a garden in the Heights that needed winterizing, a flight on Thursday, a daughter who cried easily, and grandchildren with full college accounts. I had spent 31 years waiting for the truth to be said out loud by the person who should have said it. I was still here. And now I had what had always been mine, not the estate, not the parcels, not any number written in any document in any cream-colored envelope. Just the truth, finally, and a son who had called me Mom. That was enough. That, at 63 years old, standing in the Houston sun on a Tuesday in October, was more than enough.